So the French and Indian War is over. Pontiac's rebellion is getting crushed. The colonies are upset, however, because they are, by proclamation of 1763, supposed to stay on their side of the Appalachian Mountains and wait before going into the Ohio country. The British think this is no great hardship. This is a review slide. We've seen this before. It's your reminder that the people in the 13 colonies were the world's most prosperous and least taxed people in the world. Far more prosperous. The typical American was a yeoman farmer, far more prosperous than the typical person back in Britain. People back in Britain also paid higher taxes. So the British perspective is, you guys can stay east of the Appalachian Mountains. You've got plenty of land. You guys are plenty prosperous. You guys should be happy with what you've got. Britain, on the other hand, is deep in debt after the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, and they need money. They've already taxed British people in Britain to the hilt, so Parliament is looking for other sources of revenue in conjunction with King George III. And Parliament, looking at the prosperity of the colonists, decide that they should start pulling more of their weight in the empire. Now, they're not talking about taxing Americans to the hilt. They actually set a goal. They're like, you know what? It costs money to defend the 13 colonies. We appreciate that the 13 colonies contribute economically to the British Empire. So we're not saying that the 13 colonies should pay for the entire cost of defending the 13 colonies, but we think they're prosperous enough that they should be able to pay taxes to cover 1/3 of the cost of their own defense. Right? So this is Parliament's goal. Let's put a few taxes on the Americans so they're at least defraying 1/3 of the cost of defending North America from Indian attack and from attack by the French or Spanish or other potential rivals. Now, they don't want to get to this goal overnight. They recognize that they haven't really been taxing the colonies at all so far, and after 150 years of not paying taxes to London, they are looking at a patient, gradual phase-in of taxes on the 13 colonies to move, over the course of some years toward this goal of the colonies paying for 1/3 of the cost of their own defense. That's the plan. The plan does not go well. The British start with a tax called the Stamp Act, which is a small tax on paper goods, right? So parchment, stationery, newspapers, books, playing cards, and then randomly also dice because they're used for gambling too. It's a sales tax. Now, by this time, most paper, the colonists were buying some paper still from Britain, but colonists also were making paper on their own. So most of the paper being made and used in the 13 colonies was actually produced in the 13 colonies. Now, as you can see, it's a small tax. It's a 1 penny tax. The stamp is, you put the stamp on the book or the newspaper to show that the stamp tax has been paid, the paper tax. And the British thought this will go over okay. It's a small tax, and it's not like back then most people couldn't read, so most regular folks not using a whole lot of paper, exception being New England, where they had public schools and people were doing a fair amount of reading up there, but literacy less common in the middle colonies and far less common in the South. So they're thinking this is a tax that Americans can afford to pay, because really it was middle class and wealthy Americans who were using most of the paper. So this is a small, modest beginning to Parliament's goal of getting the Americans to contribute more fiscally to the British Empire. Americans respond with rage. This is a protest in the streets of New York City. They're saying that the Stamp Act is the folly of England, England's foolishness, and the ruin of America. Really? This little tax on paper is going to be the ruin of America? Right? They're hanging members of Parliament and royal governors in effigy. These folks are angry. There were also riots. Here colonists are burning paper goods rather than submit to the stamp tax. This is the governor of the royal governor of Massachusetts. His name was Thomas Hutchinson. He actually was a descendant of Anne Hutchinson. Remember, thrown out of Massachusetts by the Puritans because she was a woman presuming to teach other women and some men about the Bible, and the Puritans hated religious freedom, so they kicked her out. Here's her descendant, Thomas Hutchinson, who gets appointed the royal governor of Massachusetts. It must have been some satisfaction for him to be leading the colony that had chucked out his great-great-grandmother all those years ago. But Hutchinson is the royal governor, and colonists who are protesting the Stamp Act view him as the enemy, and so part of the Stamp Act protests involve looting and burning the governor's mansion in Boston. So these, there's protests, and then there are riots, and this would be one of the riots. The political rhetoric is getting superheated around this. In Virginia, there is a politician, a gifted orator named Patrick Henry, and he gives a fiery speech denouncing the Stamp Act. And he, at one point in the speech, he's on a roll and he's angry, and he says, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III." All right, so George III had, of course, approved the Stamp Act. That's how it becomes law. Parliament passes the bill, and then the king assents to it, signs it into law. And so Henry at this point is attacking George III for signing the Stamp Act. And he says, Caesar had his Brutus. Julius Caesar, a general in the Roman Republic who then seized power and made himself dictator. Brutus was one of his assassins, right? So there's Brutus, one of many people there, stabbing Caesar to death to punish him for killing the Roman Republic and becoming a dictator. Charles I had his Cromwell. Well, yeah, we talked about Charles I and Cromwell earlier in this class. There is Cromwell, the Puritan rebel, holding the severed head of King Charles, who lost the English Revolution, lost the war, his throne, and his head. So, Henry is referring to the assassination of Caesar for killing the Roman Republic, the assassination of Charles I for claiming too much authority as king, and then he brings in George III. At this point, he's interrupted by his opponents in the legislature in Massachusetts. They shout, "Treason! Treason!" Because it was a crime to suggest assassinating the king. When they quiet down, Henry continues. He finishes his sentence. George III may profit by their example. In other words, should learn from their mistakes. If this be treason, make the most of it. If I'm committing treason by saying that, go ahead and arrest me. Now, Henry's betting he's not going to get arrested because the English Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution granted freedom of speech to members of Parliament. Now, the Virginia House of Burgesses is not Parliament, but Henry is assuming that the same rules apply, and he's right. He does not get arrested. Now, what do these opponents of the Stamp Act call themselves, these colonists who are opposing the Stamp Act? One label they take for themselves is Whigs. There were two political parties in Britain at the time. The Whigs were the opposition party. The Whigs back in Britain were against the Stamp Act. So the colonists here in America who were against the Stamp Act identify with that party. They call themselves Whigs. Oh, by the way, they don't call themselves Whigs because they wear wigs. People in both parties wore the white powdered wigs back in Britain at the time. The Whig is short for Whigamore, which is a Scots term for rebel. So the Whigs were the rebel party trying to push back against royal authority. Now, the other political party in Britain at the time were the Tories. It was the Tory party who had passed the Stamp Act, the Tory party who was supporting royal authority. So yeah, the opponents of the Stamp Act also call themselves Republicans. Now, that was an edgy term because there had been republics in history, including the Roman Republic, that did not have a king at all. So to identify as a Republican was suggesting that the king should have not just Whigs believe that kings should have little power. Calling yourself a Republican is to suggest that maybe we could get by without a king altogether. Another term these protesters use for themselves is they call themselves Sons of Liberty, right? And here they're gathering at the Liberty Tree in different communities. They would designate some big tree as the Liberty Tree, and again, they're hanging effigies of their opponents, members of Parliament or royal governors who supported the tax, from the Liberty Tree. Now, the Whigs, the Republicans, the Sons of Liberty established committees of correspondence. This is like a Whig pen pal club. So leaders Whig leaders in all the different colonies are exchanging letters to coordinate their activities. Here is one such leader, Sam Adams in Massachusetts, was a major Whig leader. The British regarded him as one of the most dangerous troublemakers in Massachusetts. So these committees of correspondence, this exchange of letters between leaders in different colonies, they're sharing propaganda, they're sharing talking points, messages they would like to push out through the newspapers against Britain, arguments against the Stamp Act. And they're also coordinating resistance activities like protest methods and political strategies in colonial assemblies. So, we'll be talking about all sort of big protests against British authority. The big takeaway here is through the committees of correspondence, you've got protests happening across the 13 colonies. And so, if we talk about big stuff that's popping in Massachusetts, you can bet that in other colonies there are smaller, similar echoes of the same kinds of resistance to the Stamp Act and other similar laws to come. Now, along with Sam Adams in Massachusetts, there was another guy named James Otis. There he is. And James Otis was good with words, and he coined the phrase, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." And this is, in brief form, why the colonists were so upset about the Stamp Act. Now, that tyranny is like dictatorship. It's, taxation without representation is like living under a dictatorship. It's like being a slave. And so that's where Otis was going with that.